Picture this: December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. Families preparing for church services. Sailors on the USS Arizona eating breakfast. Nurses at Hickam Field starting their shifts. And then, without warning, the sky filled with the drone of aircraft engines. Japanese Zero fighters screamed down from the clouds, and in less than 2 hours, 2,400 Americans were dead, another 1,200 wounded, and the United States was thrust into the most devastating conflict in human history. But here's what most history books don't fully capture. Among those first responders, working under fire, pulling bodies from burning ships, treating horrific wounds in makeshift hospitals, were women. Army nurses who would work for 72 hours straight without sleep. Women in intelligence roles who had been tracking Japanese communications. Civilian women who turned schools and homes into emergency aid stations. Pearl Harbor wasn't just the day America entered World War II. It was the day American women entered a revolution that would change the nation forever. Before Pearl Harbor, American society had very clear ideas about where women belonged. And that place was decidedly not in a factory, not in a cockpit, and certainly not in a military uniform. The 1930s had been dominated by the Great Depression, and conventional wisdom held that what few jobs existed should go to men, the traditional breadwinners. Women who did work outside the home were typically young, single, and employed in what were considered appropriate female occupations: secretary work, teaching, nursing, retail, domestic service. More than 1/4 of the 11.1 million women employed in March 1940 worked in personal service industries, mainly as maids or cooks. Society expected that once a woman married, she would focus on housekeeping and child rearing, leaving the workforce to men. Labor unions actively campaigned to keep married women out of jobs. Some states had laws prohibiting the employment of married women in certain positions. The idea of women working in heavy industry, flying military aircraft, or serving in combat zones was simply unthinkable to most Americans. But Pearl Harbor changed everything. Within days of the attack, the machinery of war began to mobilize at an unprecedented scale. And very quickly, military planners and government officials realized they had a massive, almost impossible problem on their hands. A problem so severe it threatened America's ability to fight the war at all. The math was brutally simple. To defeat the Axis powers, the United States would need to field a military force of unprecedented size. Eventually, 16 million American men would serve in uniform during World War II. 16 million. That meant 16 million workers would vanish from farms, from factories, from offices, from every sector of the economy. And at the exact same moment those men were leaving, the country needed to produce war materials on a scale that had never been attempted in human history. Tens of thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of ammunition, ships by the hundreds. The industrial challenge was staggering. President Franklin Roosevelt had laid out the vision more than a year before Pearl Harbor in a radio address on December 29, 1940. Speaking to a nation still at peace, but watching Europe burn, Roosevelt called on American manufacturing to help arm the Allies fighting Nazi Germany. He used a phrase that would define the American war effort for the next 5 years. Roosevelt said America must become the great arsenal of democracy. American industrial genius, he declared, unmatched throughout the world in solving production problems, had been called upon to bring its resources and talents into action. The country needed more ships, more planes, more tanks, more guns, more of everything. It was an audacious goal. But after Pearl Harbor, it became a life-or-death necessity. Manufacturing leaders like William Knudsen, former head of General Motors who Roosevelt had recruited to lead the Office of Production Management, began arranging hundreds of contracts to transform America's peacetime economy into a war machine. Auto plants that had built Fords and Chevrolets would now build tanks and Jeeps. Refrigerator factories would produce ammunition. The entire industrial base of the nation was being retooled for war. But here was the critical question. Who was going to work in all these factories? Who would rivet the fuselages of bombers? Who would weld the hulls of Liberty ships? Who would assemble the millions of rounds of ammunition? The traditional answer, young white men, was no longer available. Those men were boarding troop ships bound for Europe and the Pacific. The solution, though it seemed radical at the time, was obvious. Women. America would need to mobilize its female population on a scale never before imagined. Women would have to step into roles that society had always reserved exclusively for men. They would have to learn skills that conventional wisdom said they couldn't master. They would have to challenge every assumption about gender roles that had governed American life for generations. And they would have to do it quickly, efficiently, and on a massive scale. The question was, would American women answer the call? Would they leave their traditional roles, overcome decades of social pressure and expectation, and take on work that many people believed they simply weren't capable of doing? The answer came swiftly, and it was overwhelming. Within months of Pearl Harbor, women began flooding into defense plants. They came from small towns and big cities. They came from farms and from upper-middle-class suburbs. Young single women came, but so did married women with children. Mothers who had never worked outside the home signed up for factory shifts. By the end of 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, female employment had ballooned, quickly coming to make up more than 40% of the American workforce. And this was just the beginning. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and scope. Roughly 6.7 million additional women went to work during the war, increasing the female labor force by almost 50% in just a few short years. Manufacturing alone accounted for more than 3 million additional female workers between 1940 and March 1944, with women's share of manufacturing employment rising from 21 to 34%. In some locations, the change was even more dramatic. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, home to converted military vehicle plants, more women were working in war production by the summer of 1944 than had been employed in any job at all, in 1940. These weren't just modest increases. This was a wholesale revolution in American labor. But getting to those numbers required more than just women willing to work. It required a massive shift in public opinion, in corporate culture, in government policy. Remember, this was a society where many people genuinely believed women were physically and mentally incapable of performing industrial work. Initial resistance was fierce. Factory managers were skeptical. Male workers were often hostile. Unions worried about wage rates and post-war employment. The challenge wasn't just training women to do the work. It was convincing an entire nation that women could and should do the work. The government launched an unprecedented propaganda and recruitment campaign. The War Manpower Commission, established in April 1942, took the lead in recruiting women into war production. Posters appeared on walls and billboards across America. Magazine advertisements encouraged women to join the war effort. Radio programs featured dramatic appeals. The message was carefully crafted. Women weren't being asked to abandon traditional femininity. They were being asked to extend it, to apply their natural talents to new areas, to use their dexterity and attention to detail in service of their country. It was patriotic. It was temporary. And it was absolutely essential. But perhaps no single image captured the spirit of this transformation better than a poster created in late 1942 by a Pittsburgh freelance artist named J. Howard Miller. Miller had been hired by Westinghouse Electric to create a series of morale-boosting posters for the company's war production facilities. Of the 42 posters Miller designed for Westinghouse, one stood out for its simplicity and power. It showed a confident woman in work clothes and a red polka-dot bandana, her sleeve rolled up, her arm bent to display a flexed bicep. Above her head, in a cartoon balloon, were 3 simple words: "We can do it." The woman's expression radiated determination, capability, and pride. She wasn't asking for permission. She was declaring a fact. The poster was displayed in Westinghouse plants in the Midwest for just 2 weeks in February 1943. During the war, it wasn't widely distributed, and it was never officially titled Rosie the Riveter. That connection would come later. But the image Miller created, whether or not people knew it at the time, perfectly captured what was happening across America. Women weren't just filling in. They weren't just helping out. They were stepping up with confidence and competence to do jobs that were critical to winning the war. They could do it. And they were about to prove it on a scale that would astonish the nation and the world. For days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, something remarkable happened in Washington. The Bureau of the Budget, which had been objecting to expansion of female military divisions, suddenly dropped its resistance. Plans to create a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which had been languishing in committee, picked up speed. The attack had demonstrated beyond any doubt that women were capable of performing under the most extreme conditions. The nurses who had worked under fire at Pearl Harbor, the intelligence officers, the civilian volunteers who had stepped up in the chaos, they had proven something fundamental. And military leaders were paying attention. By May 1942, just 5 months after Pearl Harbor, Congress passed legislation establishing the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which would later become the Women's Army Corps. By July, the Navy's Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, the WWIIs, was authorized. Other branches would follow: the Coast Guard SPARS, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. For the first time in American history, women were being formally integrated into the military structure, not just as nurses, but in a wide range of roles. The call had been issued, the doors had been opened, and American women were pouring through them by the millions. What they would accomplish in the next 4 years would not only help win World War II, it would fundamentally reshape American society, challenge long-held assumptions about gender and capability, and plant seeds of change that would continue to grow for generations to come. This is the story of that transformation. This is the story of how American women's war effort changed World War II and America forever. The call had gone out. Women had answered. But answering the call and actually getting through the factory gates were 2 very different things. Because in early 1942, when the first waves of women began applying for jobs in defense plants, they encountered a wall of skepticism, prejudice, and outright hostility that was every bit as formidable as the enemy forces American troops would face overseas. Factory managers didn't want to hire them. Male workers didn't want to work alongside them. Union leaders worried they would undercut wages. And society at large questioned whether women could physically and mentally handle the demanding work of heavy industry. The resistance was particularly fierce in the shipyards. At the Kaiser Richmond shipyards in California, which would become ground zero for America's emergency shipbuilding program, 27 unions representing nearly 80,000 workers stubbornly resisted incorporating women into the workforce. These weren't abstract concerns. Male workers genuinely believed that women lacked the physical strength to handle heavy tools, that their smaller hands couldn't grip equipment properly, that they would be too slow, too distracted, too emotional for the dangerous, fast-paced environment of industrial production. Some men worried about protecting their jobs for when they returned from military service. Others simply couldn't imagine working alongside women in roles that had been exclusively male for generations. But labor shortages left companies with no choice. As millions of men shipped out to training camps and then to combat zones, the pool of available male workers shrank dramatically. Defense plants that were desperate to meet production quotas had to reconsider their hiring policies or face failure to deliver the weapons and equipment American troops desperately needed. Slowly, reluctantly, the doors began to open. And when they did, women flooded in by the thousands, then by the hundreds of thousands. The Kaiser shipyards began hiring women in 1942. Within 2 years, approximately 24,500 female workers constituted 27% of its workforce. At the Richmond facility specifically, one of the largest emergency shipyards on the West Coast, eventually 1/3 of the 90,000 workers were women. At some shipyards, the percentage was even higher. 60% of workers at certain facilities were female. These weren't small numbers. These weren't token hires to satisfy government pressure. This was a wholesale transformation of the industrial workforce. Aircraft manufacturing saw similar dramatic changes. Before 1941, women working in aircraft plants were almost exclusively confined to 2 departments: fabric work, where they sewed and doped fabric coverings for aircraft surfaces, and small parts assembly, where they worked on electrical components and other detailed tasks. Everything else, the structural assembly, the riveting, the welding, the installation of major systems, was considered men's work. Aircraft manufacturers simply believed these jobs required special skills and experience that women didn't possess. Yet by November 1943, 486,073 women were working in the aircraft industry, accounting for 36.6% of the entire labor force. At some California aircraft plants, the numbers were even more impressive. Douglas at Long Beach employed more than 16,000 women. Douglas at Santa Monica had over 13,000. Lockheed at Burbank, Consolidated Vultee at San Diego, Vega at Burbank, each hired more than 10,000 female workers. Getting women into the plants required more than just relaxing hiring policies. It required a comprehensive recruitment and training program unlike anything America had attempted before. The War Manpower Commission took the lead, coordinating with the Office of War Information to launch a massive propaganda campaign. Posters appeared everywhere. Magazine advertisements featured confident women in work clothes. Radio programs broadcast dramatic appeals. Newspapers ran stories about women succeeding in defense work. The messaging was carefully crafted to address both practical and cultural concerns. To women themselves, the campaign emphasized patriotism, economic opportunity, and personal empowerment. Your country needs you. Your husband, your brother, your son needs you. Every rivet you drive brings them home sooner. Every ship you help build saves American lives. But the campaign also acknowledged something more personal. These jobs paid well, far better than traditional female occupations. A woman working in a shipyard could earn more than double what she made as a domestic servant or retail clerk. For many women, particularly those from working-class backgrounds or communities of color, defense work represented unprecedented economic opportunity. To skeptical employers and male workers, the propaganda took a different approach. It emphasized that women had natural abilities that made them particularly suited for certain types of defense work. Their smaller hands were perfect for intricate assembly tasks. Their attention to detail ensured quality control. Their dexterity and patience made them excellent at repetitive precision work. The message was reassuring. Hiring women wasn't about abandoning traditional gender roles. It was about applying women's inherent talents to new challenges. And crucially, it was temporary. When the war ended, everyone understood, or at least was told, that things would return to normal. Training programs sprang up across the country. Some were run by the federal government through agencies like the War Production Board. Others were organized by defense contractors themselves. The programs varied in length and intensity, but all shared a common goal: take women with little or no industrial experience and turn them into competent factory workers as quickly as possible. Some programs lasted just a few weeks. Others ran for several months. Women learned to read blueprints, operate machine tools, weld, rivet, use pneumatic equipment, work with hazardous materials. They learned factory safety protocols. They learned to work in teams, to maintain production speed, to meet quality standards. And here's what surprised almost everyone. The women were good at it. Really good. Better than many people, including the women themselves, had expected. Once given proper training and opportunity, women proved they could perform industrial work at the same level as men, and in some cases, even better. The assumptions that had kept them out of factories for so long, that they were too weak, too delicate, too distracted, began to crumble in the face of actual evidence. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan became a symbol of this transformation. Built to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, Willow Run was one of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world, covering 67 acres under one roof, with an assembly line more than a mile long. At peak production, approximately one-third of the workforce consisted of women. These women did everything from clerical work in the offices to riveting and welding on the assembly line. They worked alongside men, performing the same tasks, maintaining the same production standards. And they were essential. Without them, Willow Run simply couldn't have produced the 8,685 bombers it delivered during the war. The visual imagery was powerful. Photographs and newsreel footage showed women in coveralls and work gloves, welding torches in hand, climbing onto wing sections, operating heavy machinery with confidence. One contemporary film noted that more than 40% of fuselage workers at Willow Run were women. The narrator described them as American women building strong bodies for the planes that would carry their men into foreign skies, shield them on foreign shores. The message was clear. These weren't just workers. They were patriots doing essential war work. But breaking into the factories was only the first step. Now women had to prove they could not just do the work, but excel at it. They had to demonstrate that the investment in training them, the disruption to established practices, the challenge to traditional gender roles, was all worth it. They had to show that they deserved to be there. And that's exactly what they did. The skeptics wanted proof. They got it in the form of cold, hard numbers that were impossible to dispute. At aircraft plants across the country, production managers began tracking worker performance by gender. What they discovered challenged every assumption about women's capabilities in industrial work. In some riveting operations, women weren't just keeping up with men. They were outperforming them significantly. Studies conducted at various aircraft facilities found that women riveters could drill an average of 1,000 holes per day, compared to 650 holes per day for male workers. 1,000 versus 650. That wasn't a marginal difference. That was a 53% productivity advantage. The reasons became clear upon analysis. Riveting required precision, hand-eye coordination, and sustained attention to detail, qualities that had nothing to do with brute strength. Women's typically smaller hands could access tight spaces more easily. Their patience and focus meant fewer mistakes. Their willingness to follow procedures exactly resulted in higher quality work that required less rework. And then there was Rose Benavida. On June 8, 1943, Benavida, working on a bomber aircraft, set a production record that stunned the industry. In a single work shift, she drove 3,345 rivets. 3,345. The feat was so extraordinary that she received a personal letter of commendation from President Franklin Roosevelt himself. Overnight, Rose Benavida became Rosie the Riveter, a real-life symbol of what women could achieve when given the opportunity. Her record stood as undeniable proof that women weren't just filling in or making do. They were setting the standard. The shipyards told a similar story. The Richmond Kaiser shipyards, which employed more than 90,000 workers at their peak, became a testing ground for what American industrial might could accomplish when barriers fell. Henry Kaiser's emergency shipbuilding program had an audacious goal: produce Liberty ships and Victory ships at unprecedented speed to replace vessels being sunk by German U-boats in the Atlantic. These were cargo vessels, each around 440 feet long, capable of carrying tons of equipment, vehicles, food, and ammunition to Allied forces overseas. Building one traditionally took months. Kaiser aimed to cut that time dramatically using innovative construction techniques and a workforce that included thousands of women. The results were staggering. By the end of the war in 1945, the Richmond Kaiser shipyards had built more than 1,000 Liberty and Victory-class freighter and cargo ships. 1,000 ships. Each one required approximately 150,000 rivets. The women working in these shipyards hammered, welded, and riveted alongside men in conditions that were often dangerous, always demanding. They worked on scaffolding high above the ground. They crawled into tight spaces inside hulls. They operated heavy equipment. They handled tons of steel that were cut, shaped, welded, riveted, and swung into place by cranes on a daily basis. And they suffered many of the same medical problems as male workers: respiratory illnesses from dust and fumes, injuries from heavy machinery, fatigue from long shifts. The Bay Area shipyards as a whole hired the greatest number of women defense workers in the nation. Towards the end of the war, 27% of Richmond's shipyard workforce was women, and 20% of the Moore Shipyard in Oakland. In Southern California, women constituted an even larger share. Of the 35.9% of workers hired on the West Coast, where new emergency shipyards tended to be concentrated, 54.9% were women. More than half. These weren't token numbers. Women had become essential to America's shipbuilding capacity. Aircraft production showed similar patterns. By the fall of 1943, approximately 150,000 female workers had obtained aircraft jobs in Southern California, which formed the core of U.S. military aircraft production. These women were relatively young compared to women in other industries, with an average age of 26 to 28 years. 30% were single, 35% married, and the rest divorced or widowed. Many had never held industrial jobs before. Some had never worked outside the home at all. Yet within weeks of training, they were assembling fighters and bombers that would determine the outcome of air battles over Europe and the Pacific. The scope of production was breathtaking. Aircraft plants on the West Coast increased their workforce 15-fold from 36,848 in 1940 to 474,198 in 1945. Women became a major source of these new workers, with their numbers peaking at 486,073 in November 1943. That represented 36.6% of the entire labor force in the industry. About 76% of women worked at airframe plants, while 21% worked at engine plants and only 3% at propeller plants. The economic impact extended beyond the factories themselves. Women defense workers, particularly in shipyards and aircraft plants, earned wages that were dramatically higher than traditional female employment. While African American women and other women of color often faced discrimination and were more likely to be stuck in lower wage positions, even these jobs typically paid more than domestic service, which had employed a large percentage of black women before the war. As one woman famously put it, Hitler was the one that got us out of the kitchen. The war economy was creating unprecedented economic opportunities for women across racial and class lines. But the work came at a tremendous personal cost. Most women defense workers in the Bay Area were married, and the largest shipyards estimated that up to half of their female workforce had children at home. These women carried a double burden, responsibilities on the job and at home, made all the more difficult by wartime shortages of goods, transportation, childcare, and housing. Most defense plants ran around the clock, and many women worked a 6-day week, leaving little time to manage the myriad duties of home and family in their meager off hours. For the thousands of women who migrated to the Pacific Coast states specifically to take defense jobs, life was particularly challenging. Securing adequate housing in West Coast boomtowns was difficult. Living conditions were often cramped and uncomfortable. Shopping for food and necessities became a strategic campaign as women swapped ration coupons and carefully timed their purchases. Everything about daily life was harder during wartime, and women who worked full-time in defense plants had to manage all of it. Yet they persevered, because they understood what was at stake, because they took pride in their work, because they were proving something to themselves, to their families, to society. Every bomber that rolled off the Willow Run assembly line, every Liberty ship that slid down the ways at Richmond, every fighter plane that took shape under the California sun represented not just American industrial capacity, but the skill, determination, and patriotism of women who refused to be told they couldn't do it. They had broken into the factories. They had proven their worth on the assembly line, and they were just getting started. If society thought women operating factory equipment was radical, what came next pushed the boundaries of the possible even further. Two extraordinary women, working independently but with the same vision, were about to do something that defied every convention about gender, capability, and what women could achieve in wartime. They were going to put American women in the cockpits of military aircraft. And in doing so, they would create a program that remains, more than 80 years later, one of the most remarkable achievements in aviation history. Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love came from completely different backgrounds. Nancy Love was born into privilege, the daughter of a prominent Pennsylvania family. She learned to fly at Vassar College and by her 20s had already accumulated extraordinary flying experience. Jackie Cochran, by contrast, grew up in grinding poverty in Florida, never knew her birth parents, and pulled herself up through sheer determination and talent to become one of the most famous pilots in America. Despite their different origins, both women shared an unshakable belief that experienced female pilots could serve their country in wartime, and both were determined to make it happen. The case they made was rooted in cold, practical logic. The Army Air Forces faced a critical shortage of pilots for stateside missions. Every qualified male pilot was needed for combat duty overseas. But there were dozens of essential aviation tasks within the United States that didn't require combat training. Aircraft needed to be ferried from factories to military bases. New planes needed to be tested. Target aircraft needed to be towed for gunnery practice. Flight instruction needed to be provided. These missions were vital to the war effort, but they were pulling combat-trained pilots away from the front lines. The solution, Cochran and Love argued, was obvious. Use experienced female civilian pilots to fly these domestic missions, freeing up men for combat roles. The resistance was fierce. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, initially dismissed the idea as utterly unfeasible, claiming that women were too high-strung to handle military aircraft. The notion that women could fly fighters, bombers, and pursuit planes, aircraft designed for combat and requiring tremendous skill and physical endurance, struck many military leaders as absurd. But Cochrane's persistence paid off. In early 1942, Arnold sent her to Great Britain to observe the Royal Air Force Air Transport Auxiliary, which was already successfully employing women to fly transport aircraft. What Cochrane saw in England proved her point. British women pilots were performing magnificently, and nobody questioned their capability anymore. Meanwhile, Nancy Love was working her own channels. In September 1942, the War Department authorized the formation of the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, the WFS, under Love's command. The WFS recruited 28 women pilots who became known as the Originals. These weren't novices or hobbyists. They were among the most skilled and experienced commercially licensed female pilots in the country, averaging 1,100 hours of flying time each. Stationed at Newcastle Army Air Base in Delaware, the WFS were among the first to fly nearly every aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory. But Love's program could only accommodate a small number of already highly experienced pilots. The real breakthrough came when Jackie Cochrane returned from England and convinced General Arnold to establish a comprehensive training program that would take women with basic flying skills and turn them into military pilots. In November 1942, the Women's Flying Training Detachment, the WFD, began operations under Cochrane's direction. The initial training facility was the 319th WFD at Houston Municipal Airport, but it quickly became clear that larger facilities were needed. The search for a suitable training site led to Sweetwater, Texas, a small town about 40 miles west of Abilene in the middle of West Texas. The location was remote, the weather often brutal, but Avenger Field had adequate runways and facilities. On February 21, 1943, the first class of WASP trainees arrived in Sweetwater. For the next 2 years, Avenger Field would be the only all-female air base in American history, except for male instructors and support crews. What happened at Avenger Field was nothing short of remarkable. The women who arrived came from every background imaginable. Some were young and single, thrilled at the chance to fly. Others were married, some with children, who believed their skills were needed. They ranged in age from 18 to 35, though at least one 17-year-old lied about her age to get in. They had to have high school diplomas, be at least 5 feet 4 inches tall, possess a pilot's license, and pass rigorous physical exams and interviews. 25,000 women applied for admission to the WASP training program. Only 1,830 were accepted, and only 1,074 completed the course. The training was grueling. It had to be, because these women would be flying military aircraft worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and mistakes could be fatal. WASP trainees flew 70 hours each of basic, primary, and advanced training. By graduation, they had completed 560 hours of ground school and 210 hours of flight training. Ground school covered 12 areas of college-level courses, including mathematics, physics, navigation, and aircraft maintenance. Flight training involved everything from basic takeoffs and landings to snap rolls, parachute bailouts, night flying, cross-country navigation, and work-and-link trainers, the flight simulators of the era. The standards were unforgiving. At any time, a civilian or military instructor could order a check ride to assess how students were performing. Fail the check ride, and you were dismissed from the program. There was no grade inflation, no special consideration, no lowering of standards because the students were women. They had to perform at the same level as male pilots or they didn't graduate. Period. The physical conditions were harsh. Sweetwater in the summer was brutally hot. In the winter, cold winds swept across the flat Texas plains. The women lived in barracks, wore oversized hand-me-down flight suits that they had to cinch at the waist, and dealt with the constant skepticism of those who didn't believe women belonged in cockpits. There was even a ridiculous regulation that they couldn't climb out of a cockpit without applying fresh lipstick, a bizarre attempt to maintain femininity, while performing one of the most traditionally masculine jobs imaginable. But they persevered. They studied late into the night. They practiced maneuvers until they became second nature. They supported each other through the inevitable frustrations and setbacks. And in April 1943, the first class graduated from Avenger Field. On August 5, 1943, the WFS under Nancy Love and the WFD under Jackie Cochran officially merged to form the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP. General Arnold appointed Jackie Cochran as Director of Women Pilots and Nancy Love as Executive for WASP ferrying operations. By the time the program ended in December 1944, 1,074 women had earned their silver wings. They came from every region of the country, from farms and cities, from wealthy families and working-class backgrounds. What united them was a love of flying and a determination to serve their country. They had broken through one of the most formidable barriers in American society, the belief that women couldn't handle the physical and mental demands of military aviation. Now they had to prove they could do the job. And the job, as they would quickly discover, was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The missions WASP pilots flew were anything but safe. These weren't ceremonial flights or publicity stunts. These were critical operational missions that required skill, courage, and a willingness to accept risks that many people thought women shouldn't be asked to take. And the statistics tell a story of dedication that went far beyond what most Americans understood at the time. WASP pilots flew more than 60 million miles during the war. 60 million. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to flying to the moon and back more than 120 times. They ferried approximately 50% of all combat aircraft produced in the United States to 126 bases across the country. Every type of aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory, from tiny trainers to massive four-engine bombers, was flown by WASP pilots. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, B-29 Super Fortresses, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs. These were frontline combat aircraft, powerful, fast, and demanding to fly. Ferrying was the most common mission, but it was far from the only one. WASP pilots towed targets for live gunnery practice, a mission that required nerves of steel. Imagine this. You're flying a plane at a specific altitude and speed. Behind your aircraft, attached by a long cable, is a canvas banner target. And several thousand feet away, trainee gunners are firing live ammunition at that target. Their aim is supposed to be good enough to hit the target, not your plane. Supposed to be. One miscalculation, one moment of poor judgment from a trainee, and you're in the line of fire. WASP pilots flew these missions day after day, knowing full well the risks. Other WASPs served as flight instructors, teaching male cadets how to fly. Think about the psychology of that situation for a moment. Male trainees, many of whom had grown up in a society that told them women couldn't possibly understand complex machinery or handle dangerous situations, were now being taught to fly by women who were more skilled and experienced than they were. Some cadets handled it well. Others struggled with their egos. But the WASP instructors maintained professionalism and high standards, regardless of how some students felt about being taught by women. Perhaps the most dangerous missions were test flights. When aircraft came off the assembly line, they needed to be tested before being sent to operational units. When planes returned from maintenance or repair, they needed to be flight tested to ensure the work had been done correctly. These test flights were inherently risky because you were flying an aircraft that might have defects or problems. WASP pilots volunteered for this work, understanding that it was essential and that it freed up male pilots for combat duty. By December 1944, when the WASP program was disbanded, 915 women pilots were on duty with the Army Air Forces. 620 were assigned to Training Command. 141 served with Air Transport Command. 133 worked with numbered air forces in the continental United States. 11 were assigned to the Weather Wing. 9 worked in technical commands. 1 served with Troop Carrier Command. They had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that women pilots, when given the same training as men, were as capable as men in non-combat flying. But the cost had been heavy. 38 WASP died during their service to their country. 11 died in training. 27 died during operational missions. Margaret Sanford Oldenburg was the first fatality, killed on March 7, 1943, during a routine training flight when her PT-19 crashed. She and her instructor died instantly. Jean Llewellyn Norbeck died on October 16, 1944, while flight testing a BT-13 near Shaw Army Air Base in South Carolina. The aircraft unexpectedly rolled, went into a spin, and smashed upside down into the ground in a fiery crash. One WASP, Gertrude Tompkins, disappeared while on a ferry mission. Her fate remains unknown to this day. Each death was a tragedy. Each death represented a life given in service to the nation. But here's what makes these losses even more heartbreaking. Because WASP pilots were not officially military personnel, they were denied military honors. The federal government refused to pay for funeral expenses. The bodies of these 38 women had to be shipped home at the expense of their families and friends. Their fellow WASP had to pool money to cover the costs. They couldn't be buried with military honors. No flag-draped coffins. No honor guards. No recognition from the nation they had served and died for. The financial treatment was equally insulting. WASP did not receive equal pay with military men. Their pay didn't scale based on the complexity or danger of their assignments. Any woman who graduated received the same amount of money, regardless of whether she was ferrying trainers or testing bombers. WASP were also billed for their room and board, something regular Army personnel never had to worry about. They were expected to pay for their own transportation home when the program ended. Some were allowed to fly on government aircraft if room was available and no additional expenses were incurred. Others had to arrange and pay for their own way back to their families. On December 7, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the final class of WASP pilots, 71 women in total, graduated from training at Avenger Field. But even as they received their wings, they knew the program was ending. 2 weeks later, the WASP would be officially disbanded. Before they dispersed, General Arnold ordered all commanding officers at bases where WASP had served to issue each woman a certificate similar to an honorable discharge. Similar to, but not the same as, because they weren't really military. They were civil service employees who happened to fly military aircraft in service to their country. In his final message to the WASP, General Arnold acknowledged what they had accomplished. "The WASP has completed its mission," he wrote. "Their job has been successful, but as is usual in war, the cost has been heavy. 38 WASP have died while helping their country move toward the moment of final victory. The Air Forces will long remember their service and their final sacrifice. But the nation didn't remember. Not for a long time. It would take until 1977, 35 years after the program began, before WASP were finally granted veteran status. By then, many had already passed away, denied access to the GI Bill and other veterans' benefits that could have transformed their post-war lives. Senator Barry Goldwater, himself a pilot and Air Force colonel, became acutely involved in gaining them the recognition they deserved. Understanding the opportunities the WASP had missed out on made many of the survivors passionate advocates for education and for ensuring future generations of women wouldn't face the same barriers. The WASP program had demonstrated something fundamental about capability, courage, and the artificial nature of barriers based on gender. These 1,074 women had flown 60 million miles, ferried half the combat aircraft produced during the war, and performed every aviation mission except combat itself. They had done it with skill, professionalism, and dedication. 38 had given their lives. And for decades, their country barely acknowledged they had existed. But their legacy endured. They had proven that when women are given the same training, the same opportunities, and the same respect as men, they can achieve anything. They had earned their wings, and they had changed aviation history forever. While thousands of women were transforming American industry and aviation, another revolution was taking place within the military itself. For the first time in American history, excluding nurses, women were being formally integrated into the armed forces in large numbers, wearing uniforms, receiving military training, and serving in roles that had been exclusively male since the founding of the Republic. This wasn't a small experiment or a token gesture. By the end of World War II, hundreds of thousands of women had served in uniform, fundamentally changing what it meant to be an American service member. The largest of these organizations was the Women's Army Corps, the WAC. The story of the WAC began with Congresswoman Edith Nourse Rogers of Massachusetts, who in May 1941 introduced legislation to establish a women's corps in the United States Army. Rogers had served as a volunteer nurse during World War I and had witnessed firsthand how women who served without official military status were denied benefits and recognition. She was determined that if women served in this new war, they would do so with proper compensation and legal protections. Initially, the idea faced stiff resistance. Many people simply couldn't envision women as soldiers. But Pearl Harbor changed the calculus. On May 15, 1942, President Roosevelt signed the bill establishing the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, the WAC. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Over 35,000 women from across the country applied for fewer than 1,000 anticipated positions. The Army had set an initial recruitment goal of 25,000. That goal was topped by November of that same year. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, recognizing both the enthusiasm of women who wished to serve and the growing needs of the Army, raised the authorized limit to 150,000. But there was a catch. The original WAC legislation had given women an official status and a salary, but few of the benefits granted to male soldiers. They were auxiliaries, not full members of the Army. This created practical and morale problems. In July 1943, Congress addressed this issue by dropping the auxiliary designation. From that point forward, members of the Women's Army Corps, now simply the WAC, received full United States Army benefits. The 16,000 women who had joined as WACs were belatedly granted veterans benefits in 1980. Leading the WAC was Oveta Culpabi, a Texas newspaper executive and civic leader who had been appointed by the Secretary of War. Hobby faced an enormous challenge. She had to build an organization from scratch, establish training protocols, define duties, and most critically, convince a skeptical American public that women belonged in the Army. Her strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Hobby promoted the idea that each woman serving would release a man for combat. This framing addressed both practical and cultural concerns. Women weren't trying to take men's jobs or challenge traditional roles. They were patriotically stepping in so that more men could fight on the front lines. By the war's end, more than 150,000 women had served in the WAC. They worked in more than 200 job specialties. Yes, many performed traditional clerical work. Women relieved thousands of men of secretarial, typing, and filing assignments. But an astonishing number moved far beyond traditional roles. By January 1945, only 50% of Army Air Force's WACs worked in assignments traditionally seen as appropriate for women. The other 50% served as weather observers, cryptographers, radio operators, aerial photograph analysts, control tower operators, parachute riggers, maintenance specialists, and sheet metal workers. More than 7,000 WACs served overseas in every theater of operations. They worked in England, preparing for the D-Day invasion. They served in North Africa, supporting campaigns against German and Italian forces. They were stationed in the Pacific, often close to combat zones. 3 WACs received the Air Medal for meritorious service. At the end of the war, on VJ Day, September 2nd, 1945, the WAC as a whole had 90,779 members on active duty. The Navy followed a similar path with its Women's Reserve, better known as the WAVES. The acronym stood for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, a name deliberately crafted to emphasize that these women were volunteers serving temporarily for the duration of the war. One of the first lieutenants in the reserve, Elizabeth Reynard, created the WAVES acronym specifically to accentuate that they were volunteers and their service was temporary, authorized for the duration of the war plus 6 months. Congress authorized the WAVES on July 21, 1942, and President Roosevelt signed a legislation into law on July 30th. The purpose was straightforward: release officers and men for sea duty and replace them with women in shore establishments. Lieutenant Commander Mildred McAfee, on leave as president of Wellesley College, became the first director of the WAVES. She was later promoted to commander and then to captain, becoming one of the highest-ranking women in American military history to that point. Unlike the World War I yeoman, F, who had served in limited capacities, WAVES entered the Naval Reserve as both officers and enlisted personnel. Officers received training at the Naval Reserve Midshipman School, located on the Smith College campus in Northampton, Massachusetts. Enlisted personnel received their recruit and specialized training on college campuses as well, a practical solution given that most traditional military training facilities were already operating at capacity. More than 100,000 women served in the WAVES during World War II. They filled billets at 900 locations on shore. Public Law 689 initially prohibited them from serving on ships or overseas, though that law was later changed. While 38 ratings were open to women, the majority of WAVES worked in clerical, healthcare, or storekeeper billets. Approximately 14,000 served as yeomen, the Navy's administrative specialists. 13,000 WAVES served as hospital corpsmen, providing critical medical support. At least 1/3 of all WAVES were assigned to naval aviation duties. But many WAVES performed highly specialized technical work. Women served as codebreakers for the Office of Naval Operations' highly secretive communication division in Washington. They managed the fleet's post offices. The Navy actively recruited college-educated women with backgrounds in mathematics, science, and engineering. Many female officers entered fields previously held exclusively by men, such as medicine and engineering. Enlisted women served in jobs ranging from clerical work to parachute rigging. The Coast Guard established the spars, named after the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. The Marine Corps Women's Reserve brought women into what had long been considered the most traditionally masculine branch of the military. Even the notoriously conservative Marines recognized that modern war required every available resource, including the talents and dedication of American women. Across all branches, approximately 350,000 women served in uniform during World War II, not counting nurses. About 11,000 Black women served in segregated units within the WAC, along with smaller numbers of Japanese American and Puerto Rican women. The military remained racially segregated throughout the war, a shameful reality that these brave women had to navigate while also proving that women in general deserved to serve. The American public gradually came to accept and even admire women in uniform. Recruiting materials emphasized that military service was patriotic and respectable. Photographs showed women in smartly tailored uniforms, conveying both professionalism and femininity. Hollywood celebrities joined up, generating positive publicity. The message was carefully managed, but it worked. By 1944, polls showed that most Americans supported women's military service. What had seemed radical just 3 years earlier had become normal, even expected. Women had proven they could wear the uniform with honor, competence, and pride. While WACs and WAVs served in visible roles that Americans could see and understand, another group of women was fighting the war in complete secrecy. They didn't fly planes or rivet ships. They didn't wear combat uniforms or work in factories. They sat at desks, pencils in hand, staring at seemingly random strings of letters and numbers, searching for patterns that would unlock enemy secrets. They were cryptographers and cryptanalysts, code makers and code breakers, and they were overwhelmingly women. More than 10,000 women served as code breakers during World War II. Their work was so classified that most couldn't tell their families what they did. Many took their secrets to their graves, never receiving public recognition for contributions that helped win the war. The center of this secret world was Arlington Hall Station in Virginia. Before the war, Arlington Hall had been a private women's junior college. In 1942, the Army purchased the property and transformed it into one of America's most important cryptography centers. Today, it houses the George P. Shultz National Foreign Affairs Training Center. But during the war, it was where thousands of women worked around the clock to break access codes and protect American communications. 90% of Arlington Hall codebreakers were women. Think about that for a moment. In an era when women were supposedly not capable of complex mathematical and analytical work, when they were supposedly too emotional and scatterbrained for serious intellectual tasks, the United States military entrusted the most sensitive intelligence, work in the nation to women. And those women delivered results that changed the course of the war. Jean Grabiel was one of them. A young woman from Lynchburg, Virginia, she was teaching math at a junior college when Army recruiters came looking for potential code breakers. In December 1942, Grabiel traveled to the post office in Lynchburg to meet recruiter Paavo Carlson. He offered her a job doing, well, he couldn't say what exactly because nobody had told him either. Everything was classified. Grabiel's father agreed she would be happier in Washington shuffling paper for 6 months, their assumed task. On Sunday, December 28, 1942, she arrived by train and took a cab to Arlington Hall. What she found wasn't paper shuffling. It was one of the most challenging intellectual puzzles in human history. Arlington Hall analyzed, decoded, translated, interpreted, and distributed intercepted enemy communications. Most work focused on Japanese Army codes. But just 4 weeks after arriving, Graybiel was directed to attack Soviet intercepts, an immensely secret and sensitive task even in that secret place. She had likely been chosen because her supervisors knew her as a solid citizen with an unimpeachable family background. Her code-breaking partner was Second Lieutenant Leonard Zubko, a recent Rutgers graduate fresh out of infantry school who spoke Russian. They were seated in one corner of a room and told to speak only in whispers. The work Graybiel and others like her performed would eventually become part of the Venona Project, one of the most significant intelligence operations of the 20th century. But not all codebreakers at Arlington Hall were white. In a remarkable departure from standard military practice, up to 15% of Arlington Hall's workforce was black, an effort at equity that First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt may have personally directed. This was extraordinary for the 1940s, when racial segregation was the law in much of the country and standard practice in the military. Yet at Arlington Hall, black women worked as cryptographers, translators, and analysts, performing the same highly classified work as their white colleagues. The unit of African American women code breakers at Arlington Hall was so secret that even other people working at the facility were often unaware it existed. Between the top-secret nature of the work and the racial segregation of the period, these women operated in a double layer of invisibility. Whereas stories of white codebreakers have gradually come to light as records have been declassified, the identities of most black codebreakers remain unknown. Liza Mundy, author of Code Girls, The Untold Story of the American Women Codebreakers of World War II, scoured National Security Agency records and other sources and uncovered only 2 names. Annie Briggs headed the production unit, which worked to identify and decipher codes. Ethel just led a team of translators. Ethel Highwarden just was a Howard University language professor with degrees from Ohio State and Boston University, a remarkable scholar who had divorced pioneering black biologist Ernest Everett just around 1939. William Coffey, a black man, supervised the women and recruited many of them, later winning an award for his wartime leadership. Coffey may have recruited from historically black colleges and universities like Howard. These institutions had produced generations of highly educated black women who, due to racial discrimination, had limited professional opportunities despite their exceptional qualifications. The war created an opening. The military desperately needed people with language skills, mathematical aptitude, and analytical abilities. Black women had these skills in abundance. For once, necessity overrode prejudice, at least partially. The work these women performed was extraordinary. By deciphering encrypted communications, codebreakers helped Allied forces target Axis leaders and enemy ships. They contributed to planning the D-Day invasion. They provided intelligence that saved countless American lives by revealing enemy movements, strategies, and capabilities. Every decoded message was a piece of a vast puzzle. Put enough pieces together, and you could see the enemy's intentions before they acted. Waves also served in code-breaking roles. Women codebreakers worked for the Office of Naval Operations Communication Division in Washington, tackling Japanese naval codes. The Navy recognized that women with mathematics and language backgrounds were ideal candidates for this painstaking, detail-oriented work. Hundreds of waves spent the war staring at encrypted messages, looking for patterns, testing hypotheses, gradually teasing out the logic of enemy code systems. The personal cost was significant. These women couldn't tell anyone what they did, not their parents, not their friends, not even their husbands after the war. They signed secrecy oaths that lasted for decades. Some took their service to their graves without ever revealing what they had accomplished. Many suffered the frustration of watching men who had done far less receive recognition and advancement, while their own contributions remained classified and unacknowledged. Jean Grabiel worked on code-breaking for decades after World War II ended, continuing her service during the Cold War. Only late in life, after records began to be declassified, did her story emerge. Ethel Just's granddaughter, Cheryl Everett Wormley, remembered her grandmother as an accomplished scholar and educator, but had no idea until recently that Just had worked as a codebreaker during the war. How many other granddaughters and great-granddaughters have family stories they don't even know exist? The legacy of these code girls is profound. They demonstrated that women could perform the most intellectually demanding work at the highest levels of classification and consequence. They proved that diversity strengthened America's capabilities. Black women and white women, working in segregated but parallel efforts, both delivered results that helped win the war. They established precedents that would eventually lead to women's full integration into intelligence agencies and cryptographic work. And they did it all in silence, asking for nothing except the opportunity to serve their country. That's a different kind of heroism, but heroism nonetheless. Not every woman who contributed to the war effort wore a uniform or worked in a defense plant. Millions of American women served on what historians now call the home front, a term that captures how civilian life during World War II became an extension of the battlefield. These women didn't rivet planes or break codes, but what they did was equally essential to victory. They transformed their backyards into food production centers. They mobilized their communities to fund the war. They managed households through severe shortages with creativity and determination. And they volunteered thousands of hours to support military morale. This was unglamorous work that rarely made headlines, but without it, America couldn't have sustained the war effort for 4 years. Victory Gardens became one of the most visible and widespread forms of civilian participation in the war. The concept was simple but powerful. Grow vegetables at home, and you reduce demand on commercial agriculture, which could then focus on feeding troops overseas. You also ease pressure on the transportation system, which needed every available truck and train to move military supplies. Within a week after Pearl Harbor, Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard convened a conference with representatives from federal agencies and state farming groups to formulate a national campaign to encourage home and community gardens as a defense measure. The goals were ambitious: establish 5.76 million gardens in 1942, improve public health through better nutrition, and aid in maintaining morale. The response exceeded every expectation. By May 1943, there were 18 million victory gardens in the United States, 12 million in cities, and 6 million on farms. By 1944, the number had grown to 20 million gardens. 20 million. Think about that scale. In a nation of approximately 130 million people, 1 in every 6 or 7 Americans was tending a victory garden. These weren't small token efforts. They were serious agricultural operations producing massive quantities of food. The statistics tell an astonishing story. In 1943, victory gardens produced 42% of all vegetables grown in the United States. By 1944, they were harvesting about 8 million tons of food. Some estimates put the total at 9 to 10 million tons. That's equivalent to all commercial production of fresh vegetables. Victory gardens weren't supplementing the food supply. They were matching it. Women were the backbone of this movement. While propaganda posters showed whole families working in gardens, the reality was that with millions of men overseas, women did most of the planting, weeding, watering, harvesting, and preserving. They turned backyards, empty lots, and even rooftops into productive farms. Neighbors pooled resources, sharing tools, seeds, and knowledge. Community gardens sprang up in urban areas where individual families lacked yard space. Women who had never gardened before learned from more experienced neighbors or from pamphlets distributed by the Department of Agriculture and agribusiness corporations like International Harvester and Beech-Nut. Eleanor Roosevelt famously planted a victory garden on the White House lawn in 1943, a powerful symbolic statement that everyone, regardless of status or wealth, should contribute to the war effort. Initially, the Department of Agriculture had objected, fearing such a movement would hurt the commercial food industry. But Roosevelt's garden sent a clear political message about patriotic duty, even though Eleanor herself didn't personally tend it. While victory gardens were portrayed as patriotic duty, a 1943 poll revealed that 54% of Americans said they grew gardens for economic reasons, while only 20% cited patriotism. Both motivations mattered. Whether driven by patriotism or necessity, the result was the same: millions of tons of food that eased pressure on the wartime food system. But growing food was only half the battle. Women also had to preserve it. Canning became a home industry as women put up tomatoes, beans, pickles, jams, and every other vegetable and fruit their gardens produced. Government publications provided instructions on safe canning practices. Companies that manufactured canning supplies saw unprecedented demand. Women traded recipes for how to make meals interesting despite shortages of meat, sugar, and other rationed items. The Victory Garden movement became a complex campaign developed by the federal government, coordinated by private industry, and executed by American families looking to feed themselves within the bounds of wartime rationing. While women were producing food, they were also producing revenue for the war through bond drives. War bonds, sometimes called victory bonds, were debt securities issued by the government to finance military operations. The War Finance Committee supervised bond sales, and the War Advertising Council promoted voluntary compliance. More than $250 million worth of advertising was donated during the first 3 years of the National Defense Savings Program. Over the course of the war, 85 million Americans purchased bonds totaling approximately $185 billion. Women played a prominent role in organizing and promoting bond sales. They volunteered for several drives for war savings committees, promoting the sale of stamps and certificates and encouraging the public to donate. In communities across America, women staffed bond booths, organized rallies, and went door to door encouraging neighbors to invest in victory. Some efforts were organized by women's organizations. Gamma Phi Beta sorority, for example, conducted 4 major bond drives between 1943 and 1946, raising just under $15 million, equivalent to more than $195 million in today's money. One chapter raised enough in 5 days to purchase 2 Northrop Black Widow fighter planes, which were named Gamma Girl and Gamma Phi Beta in the sorority's honor. Hollywood celebrities, many of them women, toured the country promoting bond sales. Mary Pickford, the silent film star, was declared Uncle Sam's most successful saleswoman, with reports that she was responsible for selling as much as $40 million in bonds. Singer Kate Smith conducted a 20-hour radio marathon on CBS, selling bonds on air and raising over $1,964,000 in a single day. Norman Rockwell's famous For Freedom's painting series toured in a war bond effort that raised $132 million. These high-profile campaigns were important, but so were the countless anonymous women in small towns who organized local drives and convinced their neighbors to invest in the war effort. Managing rationing required equal measures of creativity and determination. The government rationed numerous items, including gasoline, tires, coffee, sugar, meat, butter, and canned goods. Families received ration books with stamps that determined how much of each item they could purchase. Women, who typically managed household shopping and meal planning, had to navigate this complex system while trying to feed their families nutritious meals. They swapped ration coupons with neighbors to get what they needed most. They developed recipes that stretched scarce ingredients. They learned to make substitutions when preferred items weren't available. This wasn't glamorous work. It was daily problem solving under constant constraints. But it kept American families fed while ensuring that troops overseas had adequate supplies. Through victory gardens, bond drives, and managing rationing, millions of women contributed to the war effort without ever leaving their communities. They demonstrated that winning a global war required total mobilization, that every contribution mattered, no matter how small it seemed. They turned patriotism into practical action, day after day, for 4 long years. And in doing so, they helped sustain a nation at war. But here's the reality that propaganda posters and government campaigns rarely acknowledged. For millions of women, particularly married women with children, contributing to the war effort meant carrying a double burden that was almost crushing in its weight. These women worked full shifts in defense plants or served in the military or volunteered for civilian organizations. And then they came home to a second full-time job, managing households, caring for children, and maintaining family life in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. There was no break, no time off, just relentless pressure to do everything, be everywhere, and somehow make it all work. The statistics reveal the scale of the challenge. Most women defense workers in the Bay Area shipyards were married, and the largest shipyards estimated that up to half of their female workforce had children at home. Think about what that meant in practical terms. A woman might work an 8-hour shift, or more likely a 10 or 12-hour shift, at a shipyard or aircraft plant. She worked 6 days a week. Defense production ran around the clock, so shifts might start at midnight or end at dawn. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous. And when her shift ended, she couldn't go home and rest. She had to shop for groceries with limited supplies and ration coupons. She had to prepare meals. She had to clean the house. She had to care for children who needed attention, help with homework, comfort when they were scared about fathers and brothers overseas. Childcare was perhaps the most pressing problem. Before the war, most women with young children didn't work outside the home, so there was no infrastructure for large-scale childcare. The sudden mobilization of millions of mothers into defense work created an immediate crisis. Who would watch the children? Some women relied on extended family, grandmothers or aunts who could supervise kids during work shifts. Some formed cooperative arrangements with neighbors, trading childcare responsibilities. But for many women, particularly those who had migrated to West Coast boomtowns for defense work, those support networks didn't exist. The federal government eventually recognized the problem and provided some funding for childcare centers near defense plants. But the programs were limited, often inadequate, and slow to develop. Many centers had waiting lists. Others charged fees that ate into a woman's wages. Quality varied enormously. Some women, faced with no good options, made desperate choices. They left older children, sometimes as young as 8 or 9 years old, in charge of younger siblings. They brought kids to work and left them in cars and parking lots during shifts, a dangerous practice that occasionally ended in tragedy when children got hurt or wandered off. The stress was overwhelming. For women who migrated specifically to take defense jobs, every aspect of life was harder. Securing adequate housing in West Coast boomtowns was extremely difficult. Richmond, California, where the Kaiser shipyards were located, saw its population explode from 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943. Similar growth happened in San Diego, Seattle, and other defense production centers. Housing couldn't be built fast enough. Families lived in crowded apartments, converted garages, even tents and trailers. Some women shared beds in boarding houses, sleeping in shifts. Privacy was non-existent. Living conditions were often uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous. Shopping became a strategic military operation of its own. Women had to time their shopping trips around work shifts and store hours, which was complicated by the fact that many stores had reduced hours due to labor shortages. Popular items sold out quickly. Meat might be available on Tuesday morning, but gone by afternoon. Women swapped ration coupons and carefully timed their purchases to maximize what they could get for their families. Standing in long lines was common. Coming home empty-handed after an hour of waiting was frustrating but frequent. Transportation added another layer of difficulty. Many defense plants were located on the outskirts of cities. Public transportation was overcrowded and unreliable. Women who didn't have cars had to rely on crowded buses or streetcars, sometimes standing for the entire commute. Women who did have cars faced gasoline rationing and tire shortages. Carpooling helped but required coordination with coworkers whose shifts might not align perfectly. The commute to and from work could easily add 2 or 3 hours to an already exhausting day. The physical toll was severe. Women working in shipyards and aircraft plants faced the same occupational hazards as men. They suffered respiratory illnesses from dust and fumes. They endured cuts, burns, and crush injuries from heavy machinery. They developed chronic back and joint problems from repetitive motions and standing for hours on concrete floors. The noise in some plants was deafening, causing hearing damage. Women worked while pregnant, often until very late in their terms, because they needed the income and because taking time off might mean losing their jobs. The emotional toll was equally severe. Women with husbands overseas lived with constant fear and anxiety. Every telegram delivery, every knock on the door, brought terror that it might be notification of death or injury. They tried to maintain normalcy for their children while coping with their own grief and worry. They wrote letters trying to sound cheerful and supportive when they were exhausted and scared. They made decisions alone about finances, discipline, household repairs, everything that couples normally shared. USO volunteers faced different but still significant demands. The United Service Organizations was founded in February 1941 when 6 different service organizations united to support American troops: the Salvation Army, the YMCA, the YWCA, the National Catholic Community Services, the National Jewish Welfare Board, and the National Travelers Aid Association. USO canteens appeared in towns and cities across America. The organization provided entertainment, but more importantly, it provided a space where servicemen could relax, socialize, and feel connected to home. Women staffed these canteens as volunteers. They served food and refreshments. They danced with servicemen at USO dances, often for hours, making sure every soldier who wanted to dance had a partner. They wrote letters for servicemen who were illiterate or whose English was limited. They listened to homesick teenagers talk about their families. They provided comfort and connection at a time when men were being shipped overseas, knowing they might not return. This work required emotional labor that was draining in ways that physical labor wasn't. Volunteers had to project cheerfulness and optimism even when they were worried about their own loved ones. The USO attracted women who weren't comfortable with factory work, but still wanted to contribute. There was a middle ground, as one historian noted, where women were able to break traditional feminine roles, yet still keep their dresses and serve the servicemen fighting the war. For some women, This was the right balance. They could serve their country without completely abandoning conventional femininity. For others, it was simply the only option available, given family responsibilities or social constraints. The double burden took a toll that wasn't fully acknowledged at the time and has often been minimized by historians focused on the more dramatic aspects of women's war work. These women were exhausted. They were stretched impossibly thin. They were doing the work of 2 or 3 people, and they were doing it for years with no end in sight. They sacrificed sleep, health, and peace of mind. They put their own needs last, always. And when the war ended, society expected them to simply go back to being housewives and mothers, as if those years of extraordinary effort had never happened. Many struggled with that transition. After proving they could manage factories, raise families alone, and hold communities together under extreme stress, being told to return to purely domestic roles felt like a betrayal. The seeds of future feminist movements were planted in the exhaustion and frustration of women who had done everything their country asked and then been told to disappear back into the kitchen. The story of American women's war effort during World War II is often told as if all women faced the same challenges and received the same opportunities. But that narrative erases a critical reality. Women of color, particularly African American women, confronted a double burden of discrimination that made every achievement exponentially more difficult. They faced racism and sexism simultaneously, from employers who didn't want to hire them, from white coworkers who resented their presence, from military leaders who segregated them into the worst assignments, and from a society that viewed them as less capable and less deserving than white women. Yet, despite these obstacles, hundreds of thousands of Black women, along with Hispanic, Native American, and Asian American women, contributed to the war effort with courage, determination, and patriotism that was often met with hostility rather than gratitude. President Franklin Roosevelt's signing of Executive Order 8802 in June 1941 banned race discrimination in defense industries and civil service jobs. On paper, this was a landmark achievement, the first federal action against employment discrimination since Reconstruction. The order stated clearly, there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries and in government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. But in practice, it was rarely enforced and mostly ignored by employers until they were forced to hire non-whites by exhaustion of the white labor supply. Even then, war industries often filled their most menial and dangerous positions with Black employees, frequently on night shifts and in janitorial slots. African American women suffered both racial and gender discrimination, so they had to fight very hard even to enter skilled spots on the production line in aircraft, shipyard work, and other well-paying war industries. White employers and co-workers in war production centers actively hindered Black women's ability to gain employment in unionized blue-collar jobs. When Black people did get hired, they often were forced to use separate restrooms and to perform the lowest paid, most difficult work. Sometimes their employment triggered hate strikes, which erupted periodically over the war, when white workers walked off the job over promotion or hiring of African Americans into previously restricted departments. In 1943, a Baltimore Western Electric plant was forced to build separate toilet facilities for white and Black workers when white women demanded them. Think about that for a moment. Black women were willing to work alongside white women building equipment for the war effort, contributing to the same cause, supporting the same troops. But white women refused to share a bathroom with them. The hatred and prejudice were so intense that companies had to construct separate facilities to satisfy white workers' racism. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was standard practice across much of American industry. When the shipyards and other local defense industries began bringing in black workers in 1943, the newcomers encountered a wall of racism and discrimination that made every day a struggle. In Portland and other West Coast cities, African Americans faced housing discrimination that forced them into overcrowded neighborhoods. They were excluded from restaurants, hotels, and recreational facilities. White workers resented their presence and sometimes threatened violence. Black women working in these environments had to maintain professionalism and productivity while enduring constant hostility. Barred from most service occupations like telephone operator, clerical worker except in federal offices in Washington, or waitress at white restaurants, Black women mainly found war jobs in dangerous industries such as munitions plants. They handled explosives. They worked with toxic chemicals. They took the jobs that were too risky or too unpleasant for white women, and they were paid less for doing it. Even within defense industries, Black women typically earned lower wages than white women for performing the same or more dangerous work. The military was no better. Approximately 11,000 Black women served in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. But segregation meant many Black women didn't want to join, and Black WACs still faced discrimination even after enlisting. Service women faced gender discrimination from the public and male colleagues. Women of color confronted a double burden of racism and sexism. The Navy did not accept Black women into the waves until late in the war. Many Black women who joined the WAC for career opportunities were instead assigned to the least skilled work, often involving cleaning or other menial labor. At Fort Devens, Massachusetts, Black WACs who had been promised training as medical technicians were assigned to be hospital orderlies, a far less technical and prestigious job, and one to which Black WACs at Fort Devens were disproportionately assigned relative to white WACs. This disparate treatment in labor assignments and working conditions, the Army's policy of racial segregation, and frustration with officers in the chain of command created substantial morale problems. In March 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, 54 Black WACs at Fort Devens refused to go to work. It was a strike, a protest of racial and gender discrimination in both the Army as a whole and specifically at Fort Devens. Upon threat of court-martial, most of the women went back to work as ordered, but 4 continued to strike and were charged with disobeying an order of a superior officer. All 4 were convicted and initially sentenced to dishonorable discharge, loss of pay, and 1 year of imprisonment with hard labor. Their crime was demanding to be treated with basic dignity and fairness. For that, they faced prison. Hispanic women also served with distinction despite facing discrimination. Hundreds of Hispanic women joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and WAVs, serving as nurses and in other capacities. Maria Salazar was sent to the Pacific Theater as a nurse with WAC, working with the Surgeon General's office, helping wounded men. Ana Torres Vasquez served as a trainer with the 3rd Air Force and was sent to Florida to train Allied pilots in the 201st Mexican Fighter Squadron in the South Pacific. Her contribution was unique because she truly stepped out of traditional female jobs that women held. On the home front, Latinx women created patriotic organizations to help families cope with loved ones at war. The Asociación Hispanoamericana de Madres y Esposas, the Mexican-American Mothers and Wives Association, originated in Tucson, Arizona, to provide economic and moral support to Mexican-American soldiers abroad. These women raised money, cared for wounded veterans, and created recreational centers exclusively for veterans. They weren't just supporting the war effort. They were building community institutions that would endure for generations. Native American women made remarkable contributions that are often completely overlooked. As many as 1 in 4 Native American women found work on assembly lines and factories in faraway cities. Defense companies trained women for welding and riveting, manufacturing airplanes, building ships, making munitions, and sewing parachutes. About 800 Native American women served in uniform during World War II. Thousands of others who were civilians worked in factories on the home front. They brought unique skills, perspectives, and dedication to the war effort, yet their contributions have been largely written out of popular histories. The fight for equal pay revealed how deeply entrenched gender discrimination was, even as women proved their capabilities. The War Labor Board issued General Order No. 16 in November 1942, mandating equal pay for equal work. The order stated that where women were employed to replace men on jobs which were not changed, they should receive equal compensation. This seemed like a straightforward principle, but in practice, companies found ways around it. They would slightly modify job descriptions, add or remove minor tasks, claim the work was different, and thereby justify paying women less. By 1945, 37% of the civilian workforce was made up of women. However, women historically earned less than men for doing the same work. After the war, most companies replaced their women workers with returning men, with many companies hiring men only, even if they had hired women during the war. Those that did hire women changed the job descriptions in order to lower women's pay. The temporary gains women had made during the war evaporated almost overnight. For women of color, the post-war backlash was even more severe. Black women found themselves pushed back into domestic service and agricultural labor, the lowest-paying sectors of the economy. Hispanic women faced similar displacement. Native American women returned to reservations where economic opportunities were scarce. The brief moment when necessity had forced open doors quickly closed again, and discrimination reasserted itself with renewed vigor. Yet despite all these barriers, despite the racism, sexism, and economic exploitation, women of color had proven something fundamental. They had demonstrated that when given opportunity, they were every bit as capable, patriotic, and essential as anyone else. They had shown that discrimination was rooted not in reality, but in prejudice. They had planted seeds that would eventually grow into the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Their struggles during World War II revealed the hypocrisy of fighting fascism abroad while tolerating racism and sexism at home. And their courage in the face of that hypocrisy helped spark the movements that would eventually challenge and change those unjust systems. By 1943, the transformation was complete. What had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier had become the new normal. Women weren't just participating in the war effort. They had become absolutely essential to it. The numbers from this period tell a story of mobilization and production that remains almost unbelievable even today. This was the moment when American women's contributions reached their peak, when the full power of their labor, skills, and determination became visible for the entire world to see. 6 million women were working in war factories across the United States. 6 million. To put that in perspective, that was roughly equivalent to the entire population of Virginia at the time. These weren't token positions or make-work jobs. These women were producing the weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and supplies that American and Allied forces needed to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. The scale of production they achieved was staggering and unprecedented in human history. In the aircraft industry alone, women constituted more than 36% of the workforce by November 1943, with 486,000 women building fighters, bombers, and transport planes. At some California plants, the percentage was even higher. These women were assembling aircraft at a pace that German and Japanese planners had thought impossible. American factories were producing planes faster than the enemy could destroy them. That production advantage became one of the decisive factors in winning the air war over Europe and the Pacific. The Willow Run plant in Michigan exemplified this industrial might. At its peak, Willow Run was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Every hour, a complete four-engine heavy bomber rolled off the assembly line, ready to fly combat missions over occupied Europe. Women made up approximately one-third of the workforce that achieved this remarkable feat. They were riveting fuselages, installing electrical systems, assembling engines, testing controls, and performing hundreds of other specialized tasks that required precision, focus, and skill. The shipyards were equally impressive. The Richmond Kaiser shipyards, which at their peak employed more than 90,000 workers, including approximately 27% women, built an average of one ship every 4.5 days during 1943. Think about that production rate for a moment. A 440-foot cargo vessel, capable of carrying thousands of tons of supplies across the Atlantic, built from keel to launch in less than a week. At some points, the Richmond yards were producing 3 ships simultaneously on different slipways. Women welders, riveters, electricians, and pipe fitters worked around the clock to maintain this incredible pace. By the end of the war, the Richmond Kaiser shipyards had built 747 ships. 747. Each one of those vessels carried the tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, and fuel that sustained Allied armies in North Africa, Italy, France, and eventually Germany itself. Without those ships, the war effort would have collapsed. Without the women who built them, those ships would never have existed. The statistical evidence of women's contribution extended far beyond factories and shipyards. 20 million Victory Gardens, most tended primarily by women, were producing 40% of all vegetables consumed in the United States by 1944. That freed up massive amounts of commercial agricultural production and transportation capacity for military use. Women-led bond drives had raised billions of dollars to finance the war. Women volunteers staffed USO canteens, Red Cross centers, and civil defense posts in every community across America. In the military itself, women had proven indispensable. The WWII had 90,779 members on active duty by VJ Day. More than 100,000 women had served in the waves. 1,074 women had earned their wings as WASP pilots. Thousands more had served as nurses, bringing the total number of women in uniform during World War II to approximately 350,000, not counting nurses. These women had filled critical roles that freed men for combat duty. They had served as mechanics, radio operators, cryptographers, flight instructors, weather analysts, and in dozens of other specialties that were essential to military operations. Military leaders who had been skeptical about women's capabilities just a few years earlier were now publicly acknowledging their essential contributions. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, stated that the women of America had made victory possible through their work in factories and farms. General Hap Arnold, despite his initial resistance to the WASP program, praised women pilots for their skill and dedication. Even conservative military officers who had opposed women's service admitted that the war couldn't have been won without them. The impact was visible on the battlefield. American forces in Europe and the Pacific had overwhelming material superiority over their enemies. They had more planes, more tanks, more trucks, more ammunition, more everything. German generals later admitted that American industrial production, which they had initially underestimated, became impossible to match as the war progressed. Japanese military planners had gambled that America wouldn't have the will or capacity to fight a two-ocean war. They were catastrophically wrong. And a huge part of why they were wrong was the contribution of American women who had transformed the United States into the arsenal of democracy that President Roosevelt had envisioned. By late 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany from the west and Soviet forces advanced from the east, as American forces island hopped across the Pacific toward Japan, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The Axis powers were being crushed by the sheer weight of Allied military power. And behind every division that fought, behind every fleet that sailed, behind every bomber squadron that flew, were the millions of American women who had made that power possible. They had rivet guns in shipyards, they had assembled aircraft in factories, they had grown food in gardens, they had broken enemy codes in secret facilities, they had flown planes across the country, they had worn uniforms and served with honor. They had done everything their country asked of them and more. They had proven that when given opportunity, training, and respect, women were capable of achievements that society had insisted were impossible. This was the turning point, not just of the war but of American history. The barriers that had kept women out of so many fields had been broken, not by arguments or protests, but by demonstrated competence under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Millions of women had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed. They had earned money, gained independence, learned skills, and proven their worth in ways that couldn't be denied or dismissed. The question now was what would happen when the war ended. Would these gains be preserved? Would women be allowed to keep the opportunities they had earned? Or would society try to force them back into the narrow roles they had occupied before Pearl Harbor? The answers to those questions would shape America for generations to come. August 15th, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. The war was finally over. Americans poured into the streets to celebrate the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. In Times Square, sailors kissed nurses. Confetti fell from office windows. Church bells rang. Families reunited. The nightmare that had begun at Pearl Harbor 4 years earlier had ended in total Allied victory. But for millions of American women who had spent those 4 years building planes, welding ships, flying aircraft, and serving in uniform, the celebration was tinged with uncertainty and fear about what came next. The answer came quickly, and for most women it was devastating. Within months of Japan's surrender, women were being laid off from defense plants in massive numbers. The factories that had desperately recruited them, that had promised they were essential to victory, now told them their services were no longer needed. Returning servicemen had priority for jobs. The economy was transitioning back to peacetime production. And besides, everyone said, women should be happy to go back home where they belonged. By 1947, the female labor force participation rate had dropped significantly from its wartime peak. Women who had earned substantial wages as welders, riveters, and aircraft assemblers found themselves unemployed or forced into lower-paying jobs as secretaries, sales clerks, or domestic workers. The jobs that remained open to women paid roughly half what they had earned during the war. The economic independence they had achieved vanished almost overnight. The WASP program had been disbanded in December 1944, before the war even ended. 1,074 women who had flown 60 million miles for their country were told to go home. They received no veterans benefits, no GI Bill, no recognition for their service. 38 of their sisters had died wearing the uniform, but those deaths weren't acknowledged as military casualties. The WWII, WWII, and other women's military organizations continued briefly after the war, but were drastically reduced in size. Most women were discharged and told their military service had been temporary, for the duration only. The psychological impact was profound. Women who had managed factories, flown military aircraft, broken enemy codes, and kept America running during its darkest hours were now expected to be satisfied as housewives. Many struggled with the transition. They had proven they could do demanding, important work. They had earned their own money and made their own decisions. They had supported their families and served their country. And now they were being told that none of that mattered, that their proper place was in the kitchen caring for children and waiting for husbands to come home from work. But something fundamental had changed. The genie couldn't be put back in the bottle. Women had seen what they were capable of. They had tasted independence and competence. They had worked alongside other women and formed bonds of solidarity. And while many were forced out of the workforce immediately after the war, the long-term trend was toward increasing female labor force participation. By the 1950s, women were beginning to return to work in significant numbers. By the 1960s and 70s, the women's liberation movement would explicitly cite World War II as proof that traditional gender roles were socially constructed rather than biologically determined. The daughters and granddaughters of Rosie the Riveter grew up hearing stories about what their mothers and grandmothers had accomplished during the war. Those stories inspired them to challenge the limitations society tried to impose on them. When feminists in the 1960s and 70s demanded equal access to education, employment, and opportunities, they could point to World War II and ask, if women could build bombers and fly fighters then, why can't they work in any field they choose now? It took decades for American society to fully acknowledge what women had contributed during World War II. The WASP didn't receive veteran status until 1977, 35 years after the program began. Many women who had served in defense plants or as codebreakers never received any formal recognition at all. The standard historical narratives of World War II focused overwhelmingly on combat, on generals and battles and strategy. The home front contributions that made victory possible were often reduced to footnotes. But gradually, historians began to recognize that you couldn't understand how America won World War II without understanding the role women played. Every bomber that flew missions over Germany, every ship that crossed the Atlantic, every tank that rolled through France, every round of ammunition fired by American forces represented not just the soldiers who used those weapons, but the women who built them. The 6 million women in factories, the millions more in victory gardens and volunteer organizations, the hundreds of thousands in uniform, they were all essential parts of the war machine that defeated the Axis powers. The legacy of American women's war effort extends far beyond World War II itself. It established precedents that would eventually lead to women's full integration into the military, including combat roles. It demonstrated that women could excel in any field when given proper training and opportunity. It planted seeds of change that would eventually grow into the women's rights movement. It gave millions of women confidence in their own abilities and showed them possibilities beyond traditional domesticity. So, what's the answer to the central question we posed at the beginning? When their country needed them most, how did American women respond, and how did that response change both the war and American society? The answer is clear. American women responded with courage, determination, and capability that exceeded everyone's expectations. They transformed themselves from housewives and secretaries into welders, pilots, soldiers, and essential workers who made victory possible. They proved that gender-based limitations were artificial barriers rather than natural facts. And in doing so, they changed not just World War II, but the trajectory of American history for the next 80 years and beyond. The rise of American women's war effort didn't just change World War II forever. It changed America forever. And that legacy continues to shape our society today.